The evening sun was setting over downtown Hartford, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The state prosecutor had just wrapped up a long day at the office, her designer briefcase stuffed with case files she planned to review at home. She'd been working on a major fraud case for weeks, and the trial was just days away. The gentle hum of her car's engine and the soft jazz playing on the radio helped ease the tension from her shoulders. She treated herself to this luxury car after winning her first major case, and even after 3 years, sliding behind the wheel still brought a smile to her face. The leather seats still had that faint new car smell she loved. Traffic was light as she made her way through the familiar streets of her route home. She'd taken this same path hundreds of times before, knowing every stop sign and traffic light by heart. As she turned onto Maple Avenue, she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, not out of guilt, but from the way the police cruiser had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. She pulled over smoothly, already reaching for her license and registration. The prosecutor and her kicked in automatically, turned off the engine, hands on the wheel, interior light on. She'd advised countless clients about proper behavior during traffic stops, never imagining she'd be putting her own advice to use. The officer approached her window, flashlight beam dancing across her rearview mirror. She noticed him pause slightly as the light illuminated her face, his friendly demeanor shifting subtly. "License and registration," he said curtly, without explaining why he pulled her over. "Of course, officer," she replied professionally, maintaining her composure. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" She kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents, including her state bar card, a habit born from years of courthouse security checkpoints. The officer's response came with an edge that hadn't been there seconds before. "You ran that stop sign back there." His tone suggested he already made up his mind about her, despite the fact that she knew, with absolute certainty, that she'd come to a complete stop. She tried explaining herself calmly. "Officer, I'm certain I made a complete stop. I'm quite familiar with this route as I take it every day from the courthouse." But before she could finish, he cut her off. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his hand moving to rest on his belt. The sudden escalation was jarring. The situation was spiraling in a direction she'd seen too many times in her professional career, but now the familiar courthouse scenario was playing out on the wrong side of her window. Through the police radio, she could hear the crackle of dispatch voices. More patrol cars were arriving, their lights creating a disco of red and blue that attracted curious onlookers. Neighbors she'd waved to just yesterday were now peeking through their curtains, watching the scene unfold. As she carefully followed the officer's instructions, her mind raced through every legal precedent and procedure she knew. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd been preparing arguments for court, and now she was living through what would likely become another case file on someone's desk. The cool evening air hit her face as she stepped out of her car, her high heels clicking against the pavement. She held her bar card firmly, knowing it would speak volumes once someone took the time to actually look at it. The situation was about to take an interesting turn, one that would shake up not just this officer's evening, but the entire department's approach to traffic stops. Little did the officer know, his routine traffic stop was about to become a pivotal moment in his career, and a catalyst for change in police departments across the state. The next few minutes would transform a simple traffic stop into a story that would be told in police academies for years to come. Standing there in the growing darkness, the state prosecutor held her ground as the officer's attitude grew increasingly hostile. The situation was getting worse by the minute, but she knew her rights and wasn't about to let panic take over. Years of courtroom experience had taught her to stay calm under pressure. "I said put that card away," the officer snapped, barely glancing at her bar credentials. "Do you know how many fake IDs I see every week?" His flashlight beam bounced from her face to her car and back again, as if searching for something, anything, to justify his suspicions. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady. "Officer, If you just look at my credentials, you'll see that I'm a state prosecutor. I was actually in court earlier today handling the Wilson case. She mentioned a high-profile case that had been all over the local news, hoping it might ring a bell. But the officer wasn't having it. Oh, so now you're a lawyer? His tone dripped with sarcasm. And I suppose that expensive car is yours too. He circled her vehicle slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. More patrol cars had arrived, their lights painting the peaceful suburban street in alternating flashes of red and blue. The growing audience of neighbors had started recording on their phones. She could see their concerned faces in the gathering dusk, some whispering to each other, others just watching in silence. A young mother pulled her curious children back inside their house, but not before they caught a glimpse of what was happening. One of the newly arrived officers, a younger guy who couldn't have been on the force more than a few years, shifted uncomfortably as he watched the scene unfold. He'd clearly recognized her from the courthouse, but seemed unsure how to handle the situation. She'd presented cases to his unit just last month. Listen. She tried again, her professional instincts kicking in. I understand you're doing your job, but there seems to be a misunderstanding here. If you could just verify my credentials. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, the first officer interrupted, reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clicked cold against her wrists as her heart pounded in her chest. The absurdity of the situation would have been almost funny if it weren't so serious. Through the growing crowd, she spotted Mrs. Chen from the corner house recording everything on her phone. Good, she thought. Documentation would be crucial later. The elderly woman had been a character witness in one of her cases last year, and now here she was, witnessing a very different kind of injustice. The younger officer finally spoke up, his voice slightly shaky. Sir, I think I recognize her from. But the first officer cut him off with a sharp look. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. As they led her toward the patrol car, she noticed how her high heels sank slightly into the soft grass of someone's lawn. Such a small detail to notice at a moment like this, but sometimes it's the little things that stick with you. Her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about the chain of events this would set in motion. The back of the police car smelled like pine air freshener, trying to cover up something less pleasant. Through the window, she could see more neighbors gathering, their faces lit by the glow of phone screens as they recorded everything. Word was spreading fast. You could see people coming out of their houses further down the street. She heard the first officer radio in, describing her as uncooperative and resistant. The irony almost made her laugh. Here she was, sitting in the back of a police car, about to become the kind of story she'd heard from countless clients, but never thought she'd experience firsthand. The younger officer was on his phone now, walking a few steps away from the scene, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. He kept glancing back at the patrol car, then at his superior. Something was about to change. She could feel it. Years of reading courtroom dynamics had taught her to recognize when the tide was about to turn. As they prepared to leave for the station, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the car window. Perfectly pressed suit, pearl earrings her mother had given her for passing the bar exam. And now, stainless steel handcuffs. The night was far from over, and this officer had no idea what he just started. The ride to the police station felt longer than it actually was. Every bump in the road reminded the state prosecutor of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. Through the mesh divider, she could hear bits and pieces of radio chatter, and the younger officer was still making calls from his own patrol car behind them. The evening traffic parted like water around their small convoy of police vehicles. Other drivers slowed down to stare, probably wondering what high-stakes criminal was being transported. If they only knew it was the same prosecutor who'd stood before the judge just that morning, arguing a case for the people of their state. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, she noticed several officers standing outside, apparently waiting for their arrival. Word traveled fast in law enforcement circles, and she could tell by their expressions that something was up. One of them, A sergeant she'd worked with on numerous cases did a visible double take as she stepped out of the patrol car. "Hold up," the sergeant called out, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "Is that? Wait a minute." He hurried down the steps, waving for the arresting officer to stop. "That's our state prosecutor. I just saw her in court this morning." The arresting officer's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like the first hints of worry. He still tried to maintain his authority, though. She was resisting arrest and... Resisting arrest? The sergeant interrupted, already moving to unlock the handcuffs. "I've worked with her on dozens of cases. She's one of our most respected prosecutors." The metal cuffs finally clicked open, and she rubbed her wrists, feeling the circulation return. Inside the station, the atmosphere was electric. Officers who normally greeted her with respectful nods when she visited for casework now stood awkwardly at their desks, trying to look busy while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. The phone lines were lighting up. News was spreading fast through the law enforcement community. The police chief emerged from his office, his face stern. He'd known her since she was a rookie prosecutor, fresh out of law school. "Someone want to explain to me why one of our state's finest legal representatives is in custody." His voice was calm, but everyone could hear the storm brewing underneath. The arresting officer started to explain, but his story seemed to shrink with each word. The stop sign violation. The suspicious vehicle. The allegedly confrontational attitude. It all sounded increasingly flimsy in the brightly lit station, surrounded by people who knew exactly who she was. A young desk officer brought her a cup of coffee, the good kind from their break room, not the usual stuff they gave to people in custody. "I'm so sorry about this," she whispered, genuine concern in her eyes. "My sister was in your law class last year. She's going to flip when she hears about this." The prosecutor accepted the coffee with a small smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, watching as more senior officers gathered around the chief. She could hear phrases like immediate suspension and full investigation being thrown around. The arresting officer stood alone now, his earlier confidence completely deflated. The body cam footage was already being reviewed in a nearby office. Through the glass windows, she could see several officers shaking their heads as they watched. The younger officer who tried to speak up at the scene was giving his statement, gesturing animatedly as he explained what he witnessed. More calls were coming in. The district attorney's office, the mayor's office, even the governor's staff had somehow gotten wind of the situation. What had started as a simple traffic stop was quickly becoming a major incident, one that would have ripple effects throughout the entire department. As she sat in what just hours ago had been her professional workspace, now seeing it from the other side, she couldn't help but think about all her clients who'd sat in similar chairs, without the benefit of having their credentials recognized or their stories immediately believed. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong anymore. It was about something much bigger. The chief approached her, his face apologetic but also determined. "We're going to make this right," he said firmly. "And then we're going to make sure it never happens again." Behind him, she could see the arresting officer being escorted to the Internal Affairs office. The night was far from over, but the balance of power had definitively shifted. The police station's usual evening quiet had transformed into a flurry of activity. News of the incident had spread like wildfire through the justice system, and phones were ringing nonstop. The prosecutor sat in the chief's office now, her coffee cup empty, watching as the situation she just lived through began to create waves throughout the department. "Your car's being brought back from the impound lot right now," the chief said, hanging up his phone for what seemed like the 100th time in the past hour. "I've also got the mayor on the other line wanting to know how this happened." He rubbed his forehead, looking every bit his 30 years of service. The wall-mounted TV in the corner was already showing breaking news coverage. Amateur video from the scene had made its way to social media, and local news stations had picked up the story. The footage from Mrs. Chen's phone was particularly clear, showing the entire interaction from the moment the officer approached the car. "Look at this," said one of the senior officers, pausing the bodycam footage on a screen. "Right here, you can clearly see the bar card being presented." The internal affairs investigators were going through the video frame by frame, documenting every moment of the incident. Their faces grew more concerned with each passing minute. Down the hall, they could hear raised voices from the room where the arresting officer was being questioned. His union representative had arrived, but even they seemed at a loss for words after viewing the evidence. The young officer who tried to intervene was giving his statement in another room, his conscience clearly more at ease than his colleagues. A group of courthouse staff had gathered in the lobby, people she worked with every day who'd heard what happened and came to show support. Among them was the court stenographer who'd recorded her winning argument just that morning. "From the courtroom to the cruiser," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "All because someone couldn't take 2 seconds to check your ID." The prosecutor's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from colleagues and media requests. A photo of her being led to the police car in handcuffs was already circulating online, creating a stark contrast with her official courthouse photo, where she stood proudly in her legal robes. "You know," she said, finally breaking her silence, "I keep thinking about all the people who go through this without having a law degree to protect them." The room fell quiet. How many others never got the chance to have their story heard because they didn't have the right credentials to wave around? The chief nodded slowly, understanding the bigger picture she was painting. On his desk lay preliminary reports showing the arresting officer's previous traffic stops. The patterns emerging from those documents told a troubling story, one that couldn't be ignored any longer. Outside the station, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, their camera lights creating long shadows in the parking lot. The department's public information officer was trying to manage the situation, but this wasn't the kind of story that could be contained with a simple press release. The prosecutor's own phone lit up with a message from the district attorney. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. This ends now." She showed it to the chief, who nodded grimly. They both knew that tomorrow would bring changes that would affect the entire department. Just then, a gentle knock at the door interrupted their thoughts. It was the desk sergeant, holding a familiar designer briefcase. "Found this in your car, ma'am," he said respectfully. "Thought you might need it. Those case files for tomorrow's trial are still inside." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a woman who had dedicated her career to justice, who would have to walk into court tomorrow and continue fighting for that same justice, even after experiencing firsthand how easily it could be denied. As midnight approached, the station began to quiet down, but everyone knew this was just the calm before the storm. Tomorrow, this incident would be more than just a story on the morning news. It would become a catalyst for change, a moment that would force everyone in law enforcement to confront some uncomfortable truths about the system they served. The prosecutor gathered her things, ready to finally head home. But first, she took one last look at the bodycam footage still frozen on the screen. That image would stay with her for a long time, not just as a reminder of tonight, but as a symbol of all the work that still needed to be done. The next morning arrived with the kind of media storm that no police department wants to wake up to. By 7 a.m., every local news channel had the story running on repeat. "State prosecutor wrongfully arrested" flash across TV screens in diners, homes, and office buildings throughout the city. The prosecutor walked into the courthouse that morning just like any other day, except today was different. The usual buzz of morning activity stopped as she passed through security. The guards, who normally just nodded and waved her through, now looked at her with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. They'd been playing that footage all morning. One of the courthouse cleaning staff whispered as she passed by. "My daughter called me at 6 a.m. when she saw it on the news. She couldn't believe it was you, the same person who helped with her traffic ticket last month." The district attorney's office was already packed when she arrived. Senior prosecutors huddled around desks, watching news coverage on their phones. Her colleagues looked up as she entered, their faces showing a mix of anger and support. The coffee machine hummed in the corner, forgotten in the morning's chaos. "Had you seen this?" her colleague asked, holding up his tablet. Social media was exploding with the story. The video Mrs. Chen had taken had gone viral, being shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from across the country, many sharing similar experiences, others expressing outrage at how even a state prosecutor could be profiled. The emergency meeting was set for 9 a.m., but by 8:30, the conference room was already filled beyond capacity. The district attorney stood at the front, talking quietly with the police chief and several city officials. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Before we start," the district attorney announced, "I want to make something clear. This isn't just about one incident. This is about every person who walks into this courthouse seeking justice." Heads nodded around the room. The prosecutor felt a surge of emotion. This was exactly why she'd chosen this career. Meanwhile, across town at the police station, the internal affairs investigation was moving at unprecedented speed. The arresting officer's past records had been pulled, revealing a pattern that could no longer be ignored. 20 years of traffic stops, now under intense scrutiny. Back in the conference room, the prosecutor stood to address her colleagues. The room fell silent. "Last night," she began, "I experienced something that too many of our citizens face every day. But I had advantages they don't have: a law degree, a position of authority, and colleagues who could vouch for me." Her words hit home. Many in the room had prosecuted cases where similar situations had occurred, but now they were seeing it from a completely different perspective. The young intern in the corner wiped away tears as she took notes. The police chief stepped forward next, holding a thick folder. "We're announcing immediate changes to our traffic stop procedures," he stated firmly. "Every officer will undergo additional training. Body cameras will be reviewed weekly, not monthly, and any complaint will be investigated within 24 hours. As the meeting continued, the prosecutor's phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Chen. "The whole neighborhood is talking about what happened. People are finally speaking up about their own experiences. You've started something important." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered in growing numbers. They wanted interviews, statements, sound bites for their evening news segments. But inside, real work was being done. Policy changes were being drafted, review procedures were being revamped, and most importantly, people were listening. By lunchtime, the governor's office had released a statement announcing a statewide review of police training procedures. What had started as one traffic stop was quickly becoming a catalyst for systematic change. The prosecutor looked out the conference room window at the city below. Somewhere out there, other traffic stops were happening, other lives were being affected. But maybe, just maybe, her experience would help make those encounters different. The system wasn't perfect, but change was possible. She was living proof of that. By afternoon, the story had gone national. Major news networks picked up the footage, and social media couldn't stop talking about it. The courthouse steps had become a makeshift press area, with reporters from every major outlet waiting for updates. Inside her office, the prosecutor tried to focus on her upcoming cases, but her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Law professors wanted her to speak at their schools. Civil rights organizations reached out for collaboration. Even late-night talk show hosts were requesting interviews. "You won't believe this," her assistant said, poking her head in. The video hit 10 million views. People are sharing their own stories in the comments. It's like everyone was waiting for something like this to happen, to prove what they've been saying all along. The police department was dealing with its own storm. The internal affairs investigation had uncovered more than just one officer's bias. They found a pattern in traffic stop data that couldn't be explained away. The chief had called another emergency meeting, this time with all shift supervisors. "Remember that class you taught at the academy last year?" One of the senior officers approached the prosecutor during her lunch break. "We'd like you to expand it. Make it mandatory for every officer, not just the rookies. People listen to you differently now. You've been on both sides. The courthouse cafeteria had become an unofficial meeting spot for discussions about change. Judges, lawyers, and court staff gathered around tables, sharing ideas and experiences. Even the usually quiet court clerks were speaking up, talking about cases they'd seen over the years. My brother called from Chicago. One of the security guards told her as she passed through the metal detector. Said the same thing happened to him last month. But nobody believed him because he didn't have a fancy title. Now he's filing a formal complaint. The arresting officer's union representative had been in meetings all day. The evidence was overwhelming. Body cam footage, witness videos, and a career's worth of traffic stop data that showed clear patterns. Even they couldn't defend what had happened. By late afternoon, the governor announced the formation of a special task force. Its mission: to review and reform traffic stop procedures across the state. The prosecutor had been asked to lead it, working alongside police officers, community leaders, and civil rights experts. "Look at this," her colleague said, showing her a social media post. Someone had created an infographic comparing her story with similar incidents across the country. It had been shared thousands of times, starting conversations in police departments everywhere. The young officer who had tried to intervene during her arrest stopped by her office. "I've been thinking about that night," he said quietly. "I should have spoken up sooner. But now I'm helping train other officers about what to do in similar situations. Your case is already changing how we work." Television screens in the courthouse lobby showed experts discussing the broader implications. Legal analysts broke down the incident, pointing out how even someone with every possible advantage, education, position, knowledge of the law, could still face prejudice. "My daughter's in law school," the courthouse janitor told her as he emptied her office trash. "She saw your story this morning and called me crying. Said this is exactly why she wants to become a lawyer. You're showing people that change is possible." As evening approached, the prosecutor gathered her things to head home. The parking lot where she'd been handcuffed just yesterday looked different now. News vans still lined the street, but something else had changed too. People were talking, really talking, about things that had been ignored for too long. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from a young public defender. "Thank you for sharing your story. I've got a client who went through something similar last week. Because of you, people are finally listening to us." Walking to her car, she noticed a group of young law students watching her from the courthouse steps. They weren't there for autographs or photos. They were there because her story had given them hope. Hope that the system could change, that their voices mattered, that justice wasn't just a word in their textbooks. 1 week after the incident, the Internal Affairs investigation released its preliminary findings. The morning sun hadn't even fully risen when the report landed on desks across the department. What it revealed would shake the foundation of the entire police force. The officer's dash cam had captured everything, not just from that night, but from hundreds of previous stops. The data told a story that couldn't be ignored. Over 80% of his traffic stops involved minority drivers, yet the neighborhood he patrolled was far more diverse than that. "I've been going through these files all night," said the Internal Affairs investigator, spreading papers across the conference table. Dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept much. 20 years of traffic stops, and the pattern is crystal clear. This wasn't just one bad night. The prosecutor sat in on the review meeting, watching as veteran officers shook their heads at the evidence. Some had worked with this officer for years, never noticing, or maybe choosing not to notice, what was happening right in front of them. "Here's something interesting," a data analyst pointed out, pulling up a chart on the screen. "Look at the language used in his reports. Words like suspicious and uncooperative appear almost exclusively in stops involving minority drivers." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Down at the police academy, changes were already happening. New training modules were being developed, with the prosecutor's case as a central teaching point. Rookie officers watched the footage, learning how unconscious bias could cloud judgment and lead to dangerous situations. "Tell them what you were thinking," the training instructor asked the young officer who had been there that night. He stood before his fellow officers, hands slightly shaking. "Tell them why you spoke up, even though it was hard." His testimony had become a powerful lesson in doing what's right. Back at the courthouse, the prosecutor's regular caseload had taken on new meaning. Each file that crossed her desk now carried extra weight. She found herself looking deeper, questioning more, ensuring that justice wasn't just a word but a reality. "Remember that traffic stop case from last month?" her colleague asked, dropping a file on her desk. "The one that seemed pretty straightforward. I think we need to take another look." All across the office, prosecutors were reviewing old cases with fresh eyes. The police chief called an all-hands meeting that afternoon. The usually noisy assembly hall fell silent as he took the podium. Behind him, a screen showed statistics that could no longer be ignored. "This stops today," he announced, his voice firm. "Every single traffic stop will be reviewed. Every complaint will be heard." Outside, news crews were setting up for another day of coverage. But this wasn't just another police misconduct story anymore. This had become something bigger, a moment of real change, driven by hard evidence and a determination to do better. "Look at this," said one of the data analysts, pointing to her computer screen. "We've mapped every traffic stop in the city for the past 5 years. The patterns are undeniable. Red dots clustered in certain neighborhoods, telling a story that numbers alone couldn't capture." The prosecutor watched as officers gathered around the screen, some defensive at first, then gradually understanding. This wasn't about pointing fingers anymore. This was about fixing a system that had failed too many people for too long. In the break room, a veteran officer of 30 years sat quietly stirring his coffee. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "sometimes it takes seeing something happen to someone you respect before you really understand. We've been doing this job the same way for so long, we forgot to ask if we were doing it right." As the day drew to a close, the internal affairs team was still at work, combing through years of records. But now they had help. Officers from every precinct had volunteered to review files, each determined to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The prosecutor's phone lit up with a message from the police academy instructor. "Your case just changed how we teach traffic stops. These rookies will never make the same mistakes. They're learning to see people, not stereotypes." 2 weeks after the incident, change wasn't just a promise anymore. It was happening in real time. The arresting officer had been placed on administrative leave, pending the final results of the investigation. But the story had grown far beyond one officer's actions. The morning started with a mandatory department-wide training session. The large conference room was packed with officers from every precinct. Some crossed their arms, skeptical of another training day. Others leaned forward, ready to learn from what had happened. "I want you all to watch this footage again," the trainer said, starting the video. "But this time, I want you to notice something different. Notice how quickly assumptions were made. Notice how professional credentials were ignored. Notice how a routine stop became a civil rights violation in less than 5 minutes." The prosecutor had been invited to speak. As she stood at the podium, she could feel every eye in the room on her. "I'm not here to shame anyone," she began. "I'm here because what happened to me happens to people every day. The only difference is I had a title that eventually forced people to listen." In the back of the room, the young officer who had tried to intervene that night nodded along. He'd become something of a quiet hero in the department, an example of what it meant to speak up when something wasn't right. "Yesterday, I got a letter," the prosecutor continued, holding up an envelope. "It was from a grandmother in our city. She told me about her grandson's traffic stop last month. How scared he was. How helpless she felt. But now," she wrote, "she has hope things will change. Because if it can happen to a state prosecutor, People have to listen. The police chief stepped forward next, unveiling new department policies. Body cameras would now be reviewed daily, not weekly. Traffic stop data would be publicly available. A civilian review board would oversee complaints. Real changes with real consequences. During the lunch break, officers gathered in small groups, talking about their own experiences. "You know," said one veteran officer, "I've probably done thousands of traffic stops in my career. Never thought about how scary it might be for the person in the car. Never really put myself in their shoes." The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Role-playing exercises put officers in different scenarios, challenging their assumptions. The prosecutor watched as they worked through various situations, noting how differently they approached each stop now. "See how you handled that differently," the trainer asked after one exercise. "You took time to listen. You checked ID properly. You didn't let preconceptions guide your actions. That's what we're aiming for, every single time." In the hallway, a bulletin board displayed newspaper clippings about the incident. Next to them, someone had pinned thank you letters from community members, each sharing their own stories. The wall had become a powerful reminder of why these changes mattered. The department's public information officer approached the prosecutor during a break. "The media coverage has actually helped," she admitted. "People are watching us now. They're expecting better. And honestly, we needed that push to do better." Late afternoon brought a surprise visitor, the arresting officer's former partner from years ago. "I should have said something back then," he said quietly to the room. "I saw the patterns. We all did. But it was easier to stay quiet. That's on us too." As the training day wound down, the prosecutor noticed something different in the room. The crossed arms had uncrossed. The skeptical looks had softened. People were talking, really talking, about how to make things better. "Before you leave today," the chief announced, "I want you to look around this room. Every person here has the power to make a difference. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every decision matters. We're not just changing policies, we're changing lives." On her way out, a rookie officer stopped the prosecutor. "You know," she said, "I joined the force to help people. Today reminded me what that really means. It's not just about enforcing laws, it's about protecting rights. All rights. Every time." 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the city had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The prosecutor stood at the podium in the police academy's main hall, looking out at a sea of faces, both officers and citizens, gathered for the first Community Police Reform Summit. "When I was handcuffed that night," she began, her voice steady, "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. But sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the best changes." The room was silent, hanging on every word. The changes were real and measurable now. Traffic stop statistics showed dramatic improvements. Complaint numbers had dropped by 60%. Body camera footage was reviewed daily, and the department's new transparency website let citizens track every interaction. "Remember Mrs. Chen?" the prosecutor asked, gesturing to the elderly woman sitting in the front row. She didn't just record a video that night. She started a neighborhood watch program that works with our officers. Now they have monthly meetings, sharing concerns, building trust. The young officer who spoke up that night was now leading training sessions himself. "We don't just teach procedures anymore," he explained to the crowd. "We teach empathy. We teach officers to ask themselves one simple question before every stop. How would I want my family member to be treated in this situation?" In the back of the room, the arresting officer from that night sat quietly. After a long suspension and mandatory retraining, he'd made a surprising choice. Instead of fighting the changes or retiring, he'd become an advocate for reform. His honest conversations about confronting his own biases had become powerful teaching moments. Last week, the prosecutor continued, "I got a call from a police department in another state. They're adopting our new training program. Next month, I'll be speaking at their academy. This isn't just our story anymore. It's becoming a national movement. The city's new civilian review board had actual power now, not just advisory roles. They sat in the audience, wearing badges that showed their authority. Every traffic stop was reviewed, every complaint investigated, every pattern analyzed. But the real change, she said, picking up a stack of letters, is in these stories. A mother who wasn't afraid when her teenager started driving. A grandfather who felt respected during a traffic stop. A student who saw an officer admit a mistake and apologize. These are small moments, but they matter. The police chief stepped up next, sharing the latest numbers. Traffic stops were down, but public safety hadn't suffered. Community trust was up, and more people were willing to work with law enforcement. The data proved what they'd hoped. Good policing didn't have to come at the cost of dignity. During the break, people shared their own stories. A teenage boy talked about a recent traffic stop where the officer explained everything he was doing and why. An elderly man described how an officer helped him change a tire instead of just writing a ticket for stopping on the highway. You know what's different now? One veteran officer said to the group, "We're not just enforcing laws, we're building relationships. Every traffic stop is a chance to show people we're here to protect and serve, not just punish." The summit ended with a commitment ceremony. Officers and community members stood together, pledging to continue the work they'd started. It wasn't just about avoiding another incident, it was about creating a new normal. As the prosecutor gathered her things to leave, a young girl approached her. "My mom's in the police academy now," she said proudly. She says she wants to be part of the change. She says you showed her it's possible. Outside, the evening news crews were setting up for their broadcasts. But this wasn't a story about one incident anymore. This was about how one moment of injustice had sparked a wave of positive change. About how one traffic stop had started a conversation that was still going strong. Walking to her car, the prosecutor passed the spot where she'd been handcuffed 6 months ago. The memory was still there, but now it felt different. What had started as a moment of humiliation had become a turning point, not just for her, but for an entire community ready for change.